the Roman soldier stood under a sky that had turned unnaturally dark. What should have been an ordinary crucifixion, a routine task in a life shaped by violence and command, began to feel like something entirely different. He had seen men die before, too many times to count. Some begged for mercy, others cursed to their final breath. But this man, Jesus, was quiet, steady, still. He didn't scream, he didn't resist, and the soldier couldn't look away. The cross. It had always been a symbol of Rome's power, a tool to crush rebellion and instill fear. But that day at Golgotha, it became something else. Something the soldier never expected. That cross, once just wood and nails, now pulsed with meaning. It pierced deeper than any sword he had ever wielded, not into flesh, but into his soul. And maybe that's why you're here. Because what if the soldier who pierced Jesus wasn't just a bystander to history, but the first outsider to truly see what the cross meant? What if his story is not just about what he did to Jesus, but what Jesus did to him? This isn't just about ancient Rome, it's about us. You. Me. The burden we carry. The walls we build. The pain we hide behind strength. And the quiet, unstoppable power of love that shatters it all. Today we step into his sandals, not to judge him, but to journey with him. Because once you see what he saw, you can't go back. This is the untold story of the Roman soldier at the cross. And by the end of it, you may realize it's also your story. He wasn't just any soldier, he was Rome's best. A centurion, seasoned, decorated, feared. His armor bore the dents of war and the dust of distant campaigns. He had been stationed across the empire, from the scorching sands of North Africa to the turbulent streets of Jerusalem. He had been trained not only to fight, but to command. To lead men into battle, to keep order when riots broke out, and above all, to obey without question. In Rome's brutal hierarchy, centurions were elite. They weren't reckless swordsmen or impulsive young recruits. They were professionals. Hardened, precise. Think of them like modern-day special forces, men who had stared into the eyes of death and didn't blink. Their lives revolved around control. Control of crowds, of soldiers, of enemies, and most of all, of their own emotions. They were taught that mercy was weakness, and hesitation was death. Their strength lay not only in their weapons, but in their resolve. And this centurion, this man at the cross, was no exception. To him, crucifixion was procedure. He'd done it many times before. It was grotesque, yes, but it was also efficient. A slow, public death meant to terrify anyone who dared oppose Roman rule. The centurion had carried out these executions with the same cold precision he brought to every assignment. The condemned was stripped, mocked, nailed, and lifted, and then they waited, sometimes for hours, sometimes days, until death came. He didn't know the names of most men he crucified. He didn't care to. His duty was to the empire, not to the souls of the dying. That's how you survive in a world like his. You don't think, you don't feel, you follow orders. And if your hands are stained with blood, so be it. Rome demanded it. So when he was assigned to oversee the crucifixion of a man named Jesus, he didn't flinch. He didn't ask questions. Just another criminal, another act of control. And yet, something felt off. Jesus didn't look like the others. There was no desperation in his eyes, no fear, no fury, just a quiet steadiness, as if he had already made peace with what was coming. The centurion watched him stagger under the weight of the cross, not with resistance, but almost with purpose. He'd seen men claw, scream, beg for their lives, but Jesus, he walked. And that shook something loose inside the centurion. You see, for all his strength and reputation, there was a part of him that had long gone numb. War does that. Death does that. After a while, the human heart stops registering sorrow. It becomes easier to see people as obstacles rather than souls. Easier to perform violence without second thoughts. Easier to forget that the ones being crucified had mothers, names, stories. But watching Jesus stirred an unfamiliar ache in him. It didn't make sense. It wasn't logical. And that unsettled him more than anything. He tried to shake it off. Tried to remind himself, this is just another day, another death, another victory for Rome. But deep down, he already knew it wasn't. Because this wasn't just a criminal. This man wasn't like the others. And in a strange way, the centurion recognized something in Jesus that he couldn't explain. A kind of dignity that no torture could strip away. A kind of strength that didn't come from force, but from love. And that terrified him more than any rebellion ever could. Think about it. When you've built your entire life on the illusion of control, what do you do when you come face to face with something greater than you? Something you can't crush. Something that sees you, not just your rank or your violence, but your soul. That's what happened to the soldier at the cross. He wasn't weak. He wasn't broken. Not yet. But for the first time, he wasn't sure he had it all figured out. And maybe that's where the story begins, for many of us too. Because how many of us have spent our lives proving ourselves, through success, through toughness, through control, only to find ourselves empty when it matters most? How many of us carry silent burdens behind polished armor? How many of us have mistaken strength for silence or power for distance? The centurion's story reminds us that even the strongest among us are not beyond being reached. His lesson is simple. You can be the best in the world and still be blind to the truth until love opens your eyes. And it often happens not in moments of triumph, but in moments of collapse. When everything we thought was strength starts to tremble. When the routines we trusted no longer hold up. When one encounter shifts everything. The cross did that for him. It forced him to face the very thing he had always ignored. The humanity behind the pain. The divinity behind the silence. The reality that this wasn't just about empire. It was about eternity. Jesus didn't come to conquer Rome. He came to conquer hearts. And the first heart that surrendered that day wasn't a disciple's. It was a soldier's. But we're not there yet. At this point, the centurion still stands tall, still armored, still convinced he's in control. But soon, very soon, that control will slip, and what he sees next will shake everything he thought he knew. Because this Jesus doesn't just walk quietly to his death. He speaks, and when he does, the soldier will hear words that no training could prepare him for. Words that will break him, heal him, change him. Forever. Let's walk with him a little further. He stood at the foot of the cross, arms folded across his chest, eyes narrowed beneath the weight of his helmet. The nails had already been driven in. Blood darkened the wood, And still the man didn't cry out in rage or plead for mercy. The centurion had expected something, anything. A scream, a curse, a desperate prayer to be saved. But Jesus was silent, not just quiet, still. That kind of stillness unsettled the soldier more than violence ever could. He shifted uncomfortably in his armor. The sun was high overhead, but the light felt wrong, dim, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Around him, the crowd mocked and jeered. Religious leaders hurled insults. Some of the passers-by laughed. It was familiar noise the centurion had grown used to. But he noticed something. Jesus didn't return the hate. He didn't answer with anger. He looked at them with something else entirely. Was it sorrow? Compassion? And then suddenly Jesus spoke. Not to defend himself, not to condemn, but to forgive. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The centurion's breath caught. He wasn't sure he heard it right. Forgive. He glanced up, squinting into the bruised sky. This man, this condemned prisoner, was asking God to forgive his executioners. The soldier stepped back, just slightly. He felt something shift, not in the wind or the earth, but inside himself. This wasn't normal. No man he'd crucified had ever spoken like that. Most begged for water, or cursed Rome with their dying breath. But this, forgiveness. For the very people driving the nails? He didn't know what to do with it. You see, forgiveness wasn't part of a centurion's life. You followed orders, you inflicted punishment, you delivered justice, Roman style. It was bloody, ruthless, effective. Mercy had no place in his world. To forgive was to show weakness. To forgive was to lose control. But in that moment, watching a dying man offer grace to his killers, the centurion saw something he'd never seen before. A different kind of power. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It didn't need armor or legions. It was stronger. And maybe, for the first time in his life, the soldier realized how hollow his own strength really was. How all the battles he'd won, all the men he'd commanded, all the power he held, it all paled in comparison to this one act of unshakable love. That was the beginning of the unraveling. Because when Jesus said those words, he wasn't just speaking to the crowd or to God. He was speaking to the centurion too, and the soldier felt it, deep in his chest, like a crack in the walls he had built so carefully around his heart. Have you ever felt that? That sudden, terrifying vulnerability when you realize your life has been built on something empty. When a single moment reveals more truth than all your years of experience. That was what the centurion felt, and he didn't know what to do with it. He tried to brush it off, told himself it was just exhaustion, the heat, the strangeness of the day, but his eyes kept drifting back to the cross, to the man who was supposed to be just another rebel. And he couldn't unhear the words, "Father, forgive them." Forgiveness in the face of cruelty. Love in the face of violence. Peace in the face of death. It wasn't just unsettling. It was holy. That's the thing about Jesus. He doesn't overwhelm you with noise. He undoes you with silence. He doesn't demand your allegiance with force. He invites it with grace. And for a soldier like him, trained to respond to strength, to react to threats, this kind of gentleness was disarming. Because it didn't demand control. It surrendered it. The centurion didn't understand it yet. Not fully, but something in him had started to break. The kind of breaking that doesn't destroy, but makes room for something new. He looked around again. The crowd was thinning. Some had lost interest. Others had grown uneasy. The sky was darker now. Birds had stopped singing. The air had changed, like a storm gathering where no clouds could be seen. Jesus was still breathing. Barely. His body was shaking with the weight of suffering, but his eyes, those eyes, were clear. The centurion didn't know what they saw, but he knew this. They saw him. Not just the uniform, not just the authority, but him. The man behind the armor, the boy who once dreamed of glory, the soldier who had done what he was told again and again, until he forgot how to feel. And now, standing before the cross, he felt everything. That's what happens when you truly encounter Jesus. He doesn't just speak to your mind. He goes for your soul. He reaches through the noise of your life, the mistakes, the masks, the defenses, and he calls you by name, even if you've never called his. The soldier didn't know it yet, but that was the moment everything began to change. Because if this man could forgive him, what else might be possible? He looked up again, just as Jesus turned his head toward heaven and whispered words that would haunt him forever. The next part of the story would not come with swords or shields. It would come with darkness, with trembling ground, with a cry that would shake the heavens and tear the veil of the temple in two. And the centurion would be there, still watching, still listening, still being undone. Because this wasn't just about a man dying, it was about a kingdom breaking in. And the soldier, Rome's best, was about to witness what no army could ever prepare for. The clouds began to roll in, slow and unnatural, as if pulled across the sky by an invisible hand. The sun dimmed to a shadow of itself, and the atmosphere grew thick, too thick, like the breath of the world was caught in its throat. The centurion shifted his weight, eyes narrowing at the sudden darkness. This wasn't an eclipse. He'd seen eclipses before. This was different, wrong, sacred maybe, and terrifying in a way he couldn't name. Around him, the crowd had grown quieter. The mocking voices now fell to hushed murmurs, nervous glances, the kind of silence that overtakes a place when something unseen begins to press in on every soul. The centurion's men looked to him, uncertain, but he had no orders to give. What could he command against the turning of the heavens? And then Jesus spoke again. My God, why have you forsaken me?" The words rang out, not loud, but clear, and they pierced the centurion like a blade through chainmail. He'd heard men scream in agony. He'd heard last words before, pleas for mothers, curses to gods, desperate bargains with death. But never this. Never a cry so filled with sorrow and surrender at once. Never a man in such pain, still reaching toward God instead of recoiling in rage. The centurion's stomach tightened. Something was unraveling inside him, something tightly wound and long ignored. His training told him to stay composed. His instincts told him to brace for something more than death. Because this wasn't just about a man being executed. This was about something cosmic shifting. He could feel it in his bones. In the ground, in the weight of the air. The centurion wasn't a religious man, not in the way the Jews were, not in the way their prophets spoke of light and judgment and promises. But he had gods, he had temples, He had heard enough in whispers and rumors about this man called Jesus to know that the things happening now weren't ordinary. They weren't Roman, they weren't explainable, and still, Jesus didn't lash out. He didn't threaten vengeance. He didn't summon angels. He bled. He hurt, and still, he loved. The centurion couldn't understand it. Power to him had always looked like the force of legions, the clash of armor, the terror of crucifixion. But Jesus redefined power by laying it down. He didn't resist. He didn't retaliate. He absorbed it all, every insult, every wound, every nail, and gave back nothing but grace. The soldier stood there in that impossible twilight, heart pounding, breath caught between awe and fear, because in all his years of killing for the empire, no one had ever conquered him like this, not with a sword, but with surrender. Have you ever experienced that? That moment when your definition of strength is flipped upside down, when the thing you thought made you powerful, control, dominance, reputation, is suddenly exposed as hollow in the face of sacrificial love. That's what was happening to him. Because Jesus, from that cross, was doing the one thing Rome never could. He was conquering hearts. Not with might, but with mercy. Not by crushing enemies, but by forgiving them. And now the centurion, Rome's enforcer, a man trained to be unmoved, was beginning to tremble. He looked up at the man on the cross, eyes wide, searching. He didn't have language for what he was feeling, but he knew it was holy. He knew it was true, and he wasn't ready for what came next. The earth shook. It started as a low rumble beneath his boots, then roared like a lion let loose. The ground split. Rocks cracked. Screams echoed from the city. Somewhere in the distance a horn blew, but it wasn't a war horn. It was the sound of something ending, or beginning, or both. The centurion stumbled slightly, bracing himself. Behind him, others fell. The cross stood firm, but the world around it trembled. And in that terrifying, sacred chaos, something inside him broke open. He dropped to one knee, not because someone ordered him to, not because of military protocol, but because the weight of that moment was too much to bear standing. He didn't understand the theology. He didn't know the prophecies. He couldn't quote Isaiah or recognize the meaning of the torn veil in the temple. But he knew this. This man wasn't just a man. He was something more. And so, with the dust of the earth in his mouth, the centurion looked up and said the words that would echo across centuries. Truly, this was the Son of God. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't politics. It was a confession, a breaking, a beginning. Because in that moment, the centurion wasn't a soldier of Caesar. He wasn't an agent of death. He was a witness to love. He had seen the face of mercy and called it by its name. What do you do when everything you've known about strength collapses under the weight of one man's surrender? What do you do when the person you're ordered to kill ends up giving you life? He didn't have the answers, but he had seen the truth, and that truth wouldn't let him go. The sun would rise again, the crowds would scatter, the empire would continue. But the centurion, he would never be the same. Because once you've seen love like that, power no longer impresses you. Once you've witnessed grace like that, fear loses its grip. And once you've stood at the foot of the cross, the only thing left to do is follow. The days that followed felt like a blur. Jerusalem was buzzing with whispers. Rumors of a torn veil in the temple, of graves opening, of strange signs in the skies. Some spoke of earthquakes, others of the dead walking. The centurion heard it all, but none of it compared to the silence still ringing in his soul. Because what had happened on that hill wasn't just a moment, it was a collision between the world he knew and the truth he couldn't ignore. And he was still standing in the wreckage of it. He returned to the barracks like nothing had changed, but everything had. The same armor, the same sword, the same duties, but none of it fit him anymore. It was like wearing the uniform of a man he no longer was. The orders came, and he followed. But his mind kept drifting. To the cross, to the eyes of the man who hung there, to the words that had undone him. "Father, forgive them." He couldn't stop hearing it. He found himself staring at his hands sometimes, the ones that had held the spear, the ones trained for violence. He had pierced flesh without thought, without remorse. But now, even in the quiet of night, his hands didn't feel like his anymore. They felt known, not judged, but seen. As if the one he'd crucified had looked right through them and still chosen to forgive. That realization haunted him in the gentlest way. And then came the whispers. Some said the tomb was empty, that the body was gone, that his followers had stolen it in the night. But others said something more. That Jesus had risen, that he had been seen, spoken, walked among them. The centurion had executed hundreds. He knew what death looked like. He knew it wasn't reversible, but still, there was something about that man that made the impossible seem strangely believable. He tried to ignore it, tried to bury the thoughts. But how do you bury something that's already taken root in your soul? One evening he passed a group of locals speaking quietly near the temple steps. They were talking about the Nazarene, how he had appeared to Mary, how the stone had been rolled away, how the women were the first witnesses. It all sounded ridiculous, at least it would have days ago. But now the centurion found himself listening. Not to interrogate, not to refute, but to hope. Hope. That was new. He didn't know what to do with it. He had built a life on certainty, on command, on absolutes. But now hope was blooming where violence used to reign. He had seen a man die. But more than that, he had seen a man love in death. And that love was still chasing him, still whispering through the cracks of his certainty. He began to walk more slowly through the city, lingering near the places he'd once passed by without notice. The steps of the temple, the shaded corners of the market, the quiet places where people gathered and prayed. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but something inside him knew he would recognize it when he saw it. And then he did. A group of men and women gathered in an upper room, speaking of things no empire could control: resurrection, forgiveness, eternal life. They didn't speak like rebels. They weren't trying to overthrow Rome. They spoke like people who had been changed. People who had seen death and now lived differently because of it. He listened from a distance for days, too ashamed to approach, too drawn not to return. Until one day, one of them noticed him standing at the edge. A fisherman, weathered and strong, eyes sharp yet kind. He looked at the centurion, not with suspicion, not with fear, but with recognition, as if he already knew what had happened at the cross. The soldier stepped forward, unsure of what to say. But before he could open his mouth, the man spoke. "You were there, weren't you?" The soldier nodded. He couldn't speak. His throat tightened. The fisherman put a hand on his shoulder, not to rebuke him, not to confront, but to welcome. That day, the man said, was the day everything changed. The centurion didn't know whether the man was speaking about Jesus or about him. Maybe both. They talked for hours about what he'd seen, what he'd felt, what he didn't understand. And for the first time, the centurion began to see the full picture. The cross wasn't defeat, it was victory. The darkness wasn't judgment. It was fulfillment. And the forgiveness, it wasn't weakness. It was the greatest act of power the world had ever known. He learned that the veil tearing wasn't just a strange phenomenon. It was the symbol of access. The holy place, once closed to all but the high priest, was now open to everyone, even to a Roman soldier who had pierced the Son of God, especially to him. The centurion wept. He hadn't cried since he was a child, but now, in that room filled with believers, he let the tears fall. Not in shame, but in release. He had spent his life obeying the empire. Now, for the first time, he had found a kingdom worth surrendering to. It wasn't built on domination, but on love. Not enforced by fear, but offered through grace. It was a kingdom where swords were traded for open hands, where enemies became brothers, where even the man with the spear could become a messenger of peace. And the centurion knew this was the beginning. He would never wear the armor the same way again. He might still bear the title of soldier for a time, but now he served a greater king. A king who had died and risen. A king who had forgiven and called him. And so the centurion stepped into a new story, not as a commander of death, but as a witness to life. Not as a servant of Caesar, but as a follower of Christ. Because when you've seen love hang on a cross, when you've heard mercy whisper through bloodied lips, when the ground beneath you shakes and the veil is torn, you don't just walk away. You are changed. Forever. He walked the streets of Jerusalem differently now. The same sandals touched the same dust, but his steps were slower, quieter, like someone learning to listen again after years of shouting. The city hadn't changed, but he had, and that change ran deeper than any wound he'd received in battle. It wasn't something the empire could see, but it was something he felt in his thoughts, in his breath, in the way he saw people. And that's when it hit him. He wasn't just changed by the death of Jesus. He was changed by the way Jesus died. That was the real power, not the nails, not the crown of thorns, not even the earthquake or the darkness that fell. What pierced the centurion more deeply than any spear ever could was the love he saw in the eyes of a dying man. A love that spoke, that forgave, that surrendered without giving up. It was then that the centurion began to realize something that would shape the rest of his life. Power wasn't what he thought it was. For years, he had measured strength by how many enemies you could defeat, how much fear you could instill, how fast you could silence rebellion. Rome had taught him that domination was the ultimate sign of control. But at the cross, Jesus flipped that belief upside down. Power, he saw, wasn't in how many people bowed to you. It was in how willingly you bowed to serve. It wasn't in how loud your orders were. It was in how softly you loved when no one else did. The centurion had witnessed commanders rise and fall, rebellions crushed, cities burned. But none of it compared to the quiet authority he saw on that cross. Jesus had no army, no defense, no escape plan. And yet, with one whispered breath, "It is finished," he accomplished what no emperor ever could. He opened a way to redeem even the ones who nailed him there. And that thought undid him all over again. Because what kind of king dies for his enemies? What kind of king looks at the face of a soldier, soaked in sweat and guilt and silence, and sees a son? The centurion, once confident in what was right and who was wrong, now lived with softer eyes. He had seen the truth. That love was stronger than death. And forgiveness. It was a weapon more powerful than any sword he had ever drawn. That realization brought both comfort and sorrow. Comfort. Because if there was room for him in this kingdom, then there was room for anyone. Sorrow. Because he had spent so many years serving something far smaller. Something empty. Something false. He began to notice the faces of the people he once ignored. The widow clutching bread in the market, the beggar blind at the temple gate, the child playing with scraps outside a broken house. They were no longer scenery. They were stories, souls, and he began to see them through the lens of the cross. The lens of mercy. He stopped raising his voice so much. He no longer used fear to control. And though he still wore the uniform for a time, he carried himself with a different spirit, one shaped not by Caesar, but by Christ. Word began to spread among his fellow soldiers. Some whispered that he had gone soft. Others said he was acting strange. But there were a few, just a few, who saw the peace in his face and asked quietly, "What happened to you?" And when they asked, he didn't preach. He didn't lecture. He simply told the story of a hill called Golgotha, of a man who didn't fight back, of the sky that turned black and the ground that split open, and of the words, those words, that turned a killer into a believer. Truly, this was the Son of God. That declaration hadn't been made in a temple, or by a priest, or even a disciple. It had come from him, a Gentile, a soldier, the enemy. And yet, Jesus had made room for him, right there, at the foot of the cross. That truth lit a fire inside him, one he couldn't ignore, because if he could be forgiven, if he could be invited in, then who else had he written off too quickly? Who else had Rome taught him to ignore? It wasn't long before he began seeking out the followers of Jesus, not just to learn, but to join. He knew the risks. Being associated with the crucified one could cost him everything, his position, his status, even his life. But he also knew this. What he had seen couldn't be unseen. What he had heard couldn't be unheard. What had been awakened in his soul couldn't be silenced. He had followed Caesar because he had no choice. But now, he followed Christ because he believed. And belief, real belief, changes everything. It rewrites the story. It flips the script. It tears down the empire in your heart and builds something eternal in its place. That's what the cross did to the centurion. That's what love does to all of us. Because in the end, it wasn't the nails that held Jesus to the cross. It was love. And that love, that shocking, gentle, relentless love, had just claimed the heart of a Roman soldier. He couldn't keep it to himself anymore. Not after what he had seen. Not after what he now knew. The centurion, once a silent enforcer of Rome's justice, had become a witness to something far more powerful than empire. And as the days turned into weeks and the memory of the cross refused to fade, he felt a stirring within him, a call he couldn't ignore. He began to seek them out. The ones who followed Jesus, the ones who had walked with him, eaten with him, wept at his death, and now claimed to have seen him alive. The centurion didn't know what he was walking into, whether he'd be met with suspicion, or worse, rejection. After all, he had been part of the crucifixion. He had helped do it. But grace, he was starting to understand, had room even for men like him. So he walked up the stairs of that upper room with trembling hands and a heart pounding in his chest. And when the door opened, it was a young woman who looked up, eyes wide, not with fear, but recognition. "You were there," she said gently. He nodded. And then she smiled. Not the smile of someone impressed, but the smile of someone welcoming. As if she already knew that the same mercy that had found her had now found him. He sat in silence as they spoke. Peter, bold and fire-hearted, recounted how he had denied Jesus 3 times, how he had wept, and how Jesus had restored him. Mary of Magdala described that morning at the tomb, her voice trembling as she told of his voice calling her name. And as they spoke, the centurion listened with the hunger of a man who had lived too long in the desert. Every story, every word, was like water to his soul. And when it was finally his turn to speak, he told them everything. The darkness, the earthquake, the cry from the cross, the look in Jesus' eyes, and finally the words that had erupted from his chest before he could stop them. Truly, this was the Son of God. They didn't mock him. They didn't question him. They nodded, because they had said the same words in different ways. And that's when he realized. He wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't just a Roman soldier trying to reconcile guilt and wonder. He was part of something, a movement, a family, a kingdom. And in that moment, he made a decision. He would not go back. He would not return to silence, or distance, or the safety of hiding behind orders and armor. He would go forward. With a new name, not from Rome, but from heaven. From that day on, the centurion began to travel. Some said he went north, others east. His name appears in early traditions as Longinus, a name that, like his story, is shrouded in mystery and grace. But no matter where he went, one thing was certain. He carried the message of the cross, not as a theologian, not as a preacher, but as a man who had stood at the foot of grace and walked away forgiven. And that story, his story, held a special kind of power, because it wasn't told in polished sermons or lofty language. It was told through scars, through changed eyes, through the quiet authority of a man who once wielded a spear and now carried peace. And people listened, because there's something about hearing the gospel from someone who once stood on the other side of it. There's something about realizing that the cross doesn't just rescue the brokenhearted. It also redeems the ones who broke others. The centurion lived the rest of his life not trying to make up for what he had done, but bearing witness to the one who had already paid the price. And as he told his story, again and again, he always returned to one moment. That stillness on the cross, that voice that forgave, that sky turned dark. And the moment he knew the power of God wasn't in the earthquake, or the thunder, or the torn veil. It was in the man who looked at his executioners and said, "Father, forgive them. That's where everything changed. For the world, and for him. Because no one who sees love that deep, mercy that wide, and power that gentle, walks away the same. Not even a Roman soldier. Years later, when his beard had turned gray and his back bore the weight of time more than war, the centurion would often sit by fires, quiet ones in small villages, humble ones in dusty places far from Caesar's palaces, and tell his story. Not because he wanted to be remembered, but because he couldn't forget. He would begin not with sermons, not with lofty words, but with the same confession that had once burst from his lips under a darkened sky. Truly, this was the Son of God. And when he said it, it didn't come from memory. It came from witness. Because even now, all those years later, he could still feel the trembling of the earth under his feet. He could still hear the way Jesus said, "It is finished," like a king declaring victory, not over an enemy army, but over death itself. He would speak to anyone who would listen. Farmers, mothers, wandering tradesmen. The curious and the skeptical. Some came with folded arms and raised brows, but they didn't leave the same. Because this man, this old weathered soldier, wasn't preaching from books or repeating someone else's story. He was telling his own. The story of how love pierced through the armor he had spent his whole life building. And when people asked him what changed, he never listed theology or philosophy. He would simply shake his head and say, "It was him. It was the way he died, and the way he forgave." He no longer marched for Rome. He no longer enforced the law with an iron grip. Now, he walked from town to town with empty hands, but a full heart. And wherever he went, he carried not a sword, but a message. The message of the cross, but not just the event of the cross, the invitation. Because the older he got, the more he understood. This wasn't just his story. It was everyone's. He had once believed that the cross was for rebels and criminals. For people who had failed, for people far from God. But standing at the foot of it, he learned the shocking truth. The cross was for him too. A man who had followed orders, a man who had done what his empire demanded, a man who thought he was too strong, too hardened, too far gone. But Jesus didn't die just for the repentant. He died for the indifferent. He died for the violent. He died for the ones who weren't even looking for grace. And when grace found him, it didn't come with thunder. It came with silence, with stillness, with eyes that met his own, not with judgment, but with love. That kind of love changes people. That's why, when others spoke of the cross as history, he spoke of it as home. When others debated theology, he told stories of forgiveness. And when others argued about who was worthy, he pointed to himself and said, "If he welcomed me, he'll welcome you too." Because the greatest miracle that centurion ever witnessed wasn't the earthquake, or the torn veil, or even the resurrection he came to believe with all his heart. It was the miracle of a heart made new, his. And that's the miracle that still echoes today. The story of a soldier turned witness, a weapon of empire, turned messenger of peace, a man who once pierced the side of the Son of God, now pierced by grace. And maybe that's the story waiting for you too. Because the cross wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. And it still is. The sun had long since set over Jerusalem, and the streets had grown quiet. The centurion's story faded into the hush of night, but its echo lingered, soft as a whisper. steady as a heartbeat. He had stood where very few ever had, not just near the cross, but beneath it, within it, face to face with the fullness of love wrapped in suffering, majesty hidden beneath wounds. And though the years had weathered his frame, they could never wear down the memory of what he had seen. That moment, that man, had changed everything. Not with the force of a blade or the might of an empire, but with a grace that broke every wall he'd built around his soul. And maybe, just maybe, that same grace has found you, right here, right now. Because stories like his don't belong in dusty scrolls or forgotten corners of time. They live on, passed from soul to soul, in candlelit rooms, in quiet prayers, in trembling confessions, and new beginnings. This isn't just the story of a Roman soldier. It's the story of every heart that ever wondered if it could be loved again after everything. It's the story of the strong who got tired of pretending they didn't need mercy. It's the story of the weary who stopped running, the skeptic who dared to feel, the wanderer who finally looked up and realized they were standing at the foot of the cross all along. Maybe that's where you are now. Maybe you've carried the weight of battles no one else sees. Maybe your hands have been trained to hold things that don't give life. Maybe you've kept your heart armored because it felt safer than being seen. But the truth is, Jesus sees you. He always has. Even when you were far off, even when your head was turned, even when you were the one holding the spear. His eyes have never looked away. And now, like that soldier, you have a choice. Not just to remember the story, but to enter it. Not just to admire the cross, but to respond to it. Because the same love that found him is reaching for you. It doesn't require perfection. It doesn't wait for the right words or the perfect moment. It simply asks for honesty, for an open heart, for the courage to say, yes, I see it now. I believe. If this story stirred something in you, don't walk away from it. Sit with it. Let it speak to the places inside you that you've kept quiet for too long. And when you're ready, take that next step. Whisper the words. Say the prayer. Reach back. And if this journey has moved you, touched you, or reminded you of who you truly are, I want to invite you to walk a little further with us. This channel is a place for stories like these. Stories of redemption, mystery, and hope. Stories that dig deep into Scripture, not to just explain what happened, but to reveal what it still means. If you're hungry for more, if you want to keep discovering the untold truths of the Bible, if you want to hear more stories like the one you've just experienced, subscribe. Be part of something more than content. Be part of a community. And if this video spoke to you, really spoke to you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, not for the algorithm, but because stories of transformation deserve to be seen, deserve to be heard. Share it with someone who might need to hear that they're not too far gone, that grace still reaches, that Jesus still forgives. And leave us a comment. Tell us what part of the centurion's journey mirrored your own. Was it the silence? The breaking? The whisper of forgiveness that hit when you least expected it? We'd love to hear your story, because just like his, it matters. Deeply. So maybe tonight, as the world winds down and your heart is still, you'll find yourself thinking about that soldier, about the spear he once held and the cross he came to believe in, about the declaration that changed everything, not just for him, but for the world. Truly, this was the Son of God. Let those words stay with you. Let them settle into the places that still need healing. And let them be more than a line in a video. Let them be the beginning of your own transformation. Because no matter where you've come from, no matter what you've done, the cross is still open. The invitation still stands. And grace, shocking, undeserved, overwhelming grace, is still waiting. So come. The story isn't finished yet. And neither are you.